You are lying in the tall grass of the African savanna somewhere around 200,000 years ago, and the first thing you feel isn't the fear of a lion or the chill of the evening air. It is a sharp electric prick on the back of your neck, a tiny localized heat that blooms into a sudden, maddening itch. You reach back to swat it, but your fingers meet only air, while the high-pitched metallic whine of a single pair of wings drills into your ear canal. It is a sound that, even now, in our modern world of steel and glass, can make a grown human bolt upright in a cold sweat. But for you, in the deep past, that sound is more than an annoyance. It is the herald of a silent killer that has already begun to rewrite your very survival. We often imagine our ancestors fighting off massive, toothy predators with spears and fire. But the real war, the one that actually determined who lived and who died, was fought against an enemy the size of a grain of rice. This is the story of humanity's oldest and most lopsided conflict, a deep-time chronological journey through the hundreds of thousands of years we spent being hunted by the mosquito. To understand how we survived, we have to go back further than you might expect, long before we were even human. You see, the mosquito didn't just show up one day to ruin our summer. It has been perfecting the art of the kill for nearly 100 million years. But the real trouble for our specific lineage started about 7 million years ago, which, in the grand scheme of things, is just a blink of an eye, when we split off from the ancestors of modern chimpanzees. Research published in the journal Nature suggests that the most lethal species of malaria, Plasmodium falciparum, actually made the jump from gorillas to humans at some point in our deep evolutionary past. We weren't just living alongside these insects, we were being colonized by the parasites they carried. In those earliest days, our ancestors, think of the famous Lucy, the Australopithecus, didn't have nets, and they certainly didn't have chemical sprays. They had to rely on the same primary defenses that most primates use today, social grooming and mud. If you've ever seen a group of macaques or baboons picking through each other's fur, you're looking at an ancient pest control system. By meticulously removing insects before they could bite, early hominids were performing a crude but necessary form of preventative medicine. And when the bugs became too much to handle, they did what many animals still do. They caked themselves in mud and clay. A thick layer of dried earth creates a physical barrier that even the most determined mosquito proboscis struggles to penetrate. It was messy and it was uncomfortable, but it was the first line of defense in a war that was only just beginning to heat up. Moving forward into the Pleistocene era, a time of massive ice sheets and shifting grasslands, humans began to unlock a weapon that changed everything: fire. We usually think of fire as a tool for cooking or warmth, but for an ancient human trying to sleep in a damp cave or a temporary brush shelter, fire was a biological shield. Mosquitoes are incredibly sophisticated hunters, using a suite of sensors to find you in the dark. They track the carbon dioxide in your breath, the infrared heat of your skin, and the specific cocktail of chemicals in your sweat. However, a smoky fire throws a massive wrench into those sensors. The particulate matter in the smoke clogs their sensory organs, while the heat of the fire creates erratic air currents that the tiny, weak-flying insects can't navigate. As a side note, this is why your campfire smoke always seems to follow you. The fire is drawing in air, and you, standing nearby, are interrupting that flow. Our ancestors learned very early on that if you burn certain damp woods or aromatic leaves, the smoke becomes even more repellent. This wasn't just luck, it was the birth of ethnobotany. By the time we reached the middle of the Stone Age, roughly 100,000 years ago, humans were no longer just passive victims. They were becoming experts at reading the landscape. They noticed that if you camped right on the edge of a stagnant pool of water, your children would burn with fever a few weeks later. They didn't know about parasites, and they didn't know about larvae, but they understood the connection between the bad air of the swamps and the sickness that followed. This led to a nomadic strategy of smart settlement. They would choose high, breezy ridges where the wind, which is a mosquito's natural enemy, would keep the swarms at bay. They timed their migrations to avoid the peak of the rainy season in certain low-lying areas. It was a game of hide-and-seek played across entire continents, with the humans constantly moving to find the sweet spot where the water was close enough to drink, but the mosquitoes were too few to kill them. But then, about 10,000 years ago, humanity made a choice that should have been our death warrant. We stopped moving. The agricultural revolution is usually framed as a great leap forward, but for the mosquito, it was an all-you-can-eat buffet that stayed in one place. When we began to clear forests to plant crops like rice and wheat, we did two things that favored the mosquito perfectly. First, we created massive amounts of standing water through irrigation. Second, we packed ourselves into permanent villages with domestic animals, providing a dense, stationary target for the insects. This was the moment the war turned truly ugly. Populations that had been relatively healthy as hunters and gatherers suddenly found themselves under siege by malaria, yellow fever, and dengue on a scale never before seen, which, if you think about it, makes the survival of civilization itself a bit of a miracle. In this era of early farming, we see the first evidence of humans using sophisticated physical barriers. In ancient Egypt, as documented by the Greek historian Herodotus, people living in the marshy regions of the Nile Delta developed a clever solution. Since they couldn't escape the water, they slept in high towers, knowing that mosquitoes are generally low-altitude flyers that struggle to rise more than a few meters off the ground. Others used their fishing nets, draping them over their sleeping areas. Even though the holes in a fishing net are far too large to stop a mosquito, the Egyptians discovered that if they smeared the net with oils or simply relied on the way the mesh broke up the air, the insects were less likely to find their way through. It was the precursor to the modern insecticide-treated bed net, a technology that still saves millions of lives today. As we move into the classical era, around 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, the strategies became even more varied. In the Vedic texts of ancient India, there are descriptions of using specific incense and oils derived from plants like neem and holy basil to keep biting flies away. In the Roman Empire, the battle against the mosquito became a matter of state engineering. The Romans were plagued by what they called Roman fever, which we now know was a particularly deadly strain of malaria. They didn't realize the mosquito was the cause, blaming it instead on the miasma, or bad air, rising from the Pontine marshes. Their solution was to try and drain the swamps entirely. This was a massive undertaking of canals and pumps, and while they never quite succeeded in drying out the marshes, their obsession with drainage unintentionally destroyed the breeding grounds of the Anopheles mosquito. It was a massive public health victory won for all the wrong reasons. However, despite the fire, the nets, and the swamp draining, the mosquito was still winning. The sheer number of deaths was staggering. To get an idea of the scale, we have to look at the hidden history of the mosquito's impact. Some historians estimate that nearly half of all humans who have ever lived, roughly 50 billion people, may have died from mosquito-borne illnesses. This constant grinding pressure from a single enemy was so intense that it did something that smoke and nets could never do. It began to change our very biology. This is perhaps the most fascinating chapter of our survival story, because it shows that when we couldn't outsmart the mosquito, our bodies had to out-evolve it. If you look at the genetic makeup of human populations in areas where malaria has been endemic for thousands of years, you find a series of scars left by the mosquito. The most famous of these is the sickle cell trait. In 1954, a scientist named Anthony Allison was working in East Africa when he noticed a strange correlation. People who carried a specific genetic mutation that caused their red blood cells to take on a sickle shape were much more likely to survive a malaria infection. The malaria parasite, which needs a healthy red blood cell to reproduce, simply can't thrive in a sickle-shaped cell. This mutation was a brutal trade-off. If you inherited the gene from both parents, you suffered from sickle cell anemia, a painful and often fatal disease. But if you inherited it from only one parent, you were protected from the mosquito's deadliest weapon. Evolution, it seems, is a cold accountant that cares more about the survival of the group than the comfort of the individual. But sickle cell wasn't the only biological defense we developed. There's also the Duffy antigen, a protein on the surface of red blood cells that some malaria parasites use as a key to enter the cell. In many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, a huge percentage of the population has evolved to be Duffy negative, meaning they've essentially changed the locks on their blood cells so the parasite can't get in. Then there's G6PD deficiency, a genetic condition common in the Mediterranean and parts of Asia that makes red blood cells break down more easily. While this can cause health problems, it also makes the blood a hostile environment for the malaria parasite. For thousands of years, the mosquito was effectively editing the human genome, killing off those with weak blood and allowing only those with these specific, often painful mutations to survive and pass on their genes. We are, quite literally, the descendants of the people whose blood was too weird for the mosquito to eat. This biological war also had a massive impact on the course of human history and the rise and fall of empires. Think about the Crusades or the European colonization of Africa and the Americas. Time and again, massive armies of people who had no genetic resistance to local mosquito-borne diseases would march into a new territory and be absolutely decimated. In the American Revolutionary War, the British Army was famously crippled by malaria in the southern colonies, a factor that some historians argue was crucial to the American victory. The mosquito was acting as a silent, invisible border guard, preventing certain groups of humans from moving into new areas while protecting those who had lived there long enough to develop a biological or cultural defense. It dictated where we could build cities, where we could farm, and where we could win wars. As we move into the late 19th century, we reach a massive turning point in our chronological journey. For hundreds of thousands of years, we had been fighting a ghost. We knew the fever and we knew the insect, but we didn't know they were the same thing. Then, in 1897, a British doctor named Ronald Ross, working in India, peered through a microscope and saw the malaria parasite inside the stomach of a mosquito. It was a eureka moment that changed the war forever. For the first time, we had a clear target. We didn't just have to hide from the bad air or burn smudge fires. We could go after the insect itself. This discovery led to the era of modern mosquito control, using oil to coat the surface of ponds to suffocate larvae, the development of synthetic repellents like DEET, and eventually the use of powerful insecticides like DDT. But even with our modern science, the mosquito has proven to be an incredibly resilient foe. Every time we develop a new chemical to kill them, they evolve a resistance to it. Every time we create a new drug to kill the parasite finds a way around it. We are still in the middle of this ancient war, and the stakes are still incredibly high. Even today, in our world of smartphones and space travel, a child dies from a mosquito bite every minute. The clever defenses our ancestors used, the smoke, the nets, the smart settlement, are still the primary tools for millions of people around the globe. We have come so far, and yet in many ways, we are still that same human lying in the grass, hearing that thin, high-pitched whine and hoping we're not the one who gets picked tonight. So how did ancient humans survive? They survived by being the most adaptable creature on the planet. They used their brains to invent smoke shields and nets. They used their observations to map the fever lands. And when all else failed, their very blood changed to keep them standing. They didn't win the war, we still haven't won it, but they endured it. They took the heaviest blows nature could throw at them and kept moving forward, leaving behind a genetic and cultural legacy that is written into the lives of every person on Earth today. It's a sobering thought that your very existence is proof of 1,000 generations of successful swats and smoky nights. We tend to think of history as a series of great men and big battles, but the most influential figure in our past might just be a tiny insect with a thirst for human blood. As we look toward the future, we're starting to explore even more radical ways to fight back. Scientists are now working on gene drive technology, which could potentially allow us to genetically engineer mosquitoes so that they can no longer carry diseases, or even to wipe out entire species of mosquitoes altogether. It's a controversial idea, fraught with ecological risks, but it's the latest move in a game of chess that has been going on for 7 million years. Whether we should do it is a question for the philosophers and the ecologists, but the fact that we can even consider it shows how far we've come from the days of smearing ourselves in mud and sleeping on breezy ridges. But for now, the mosquito remains the deadliest animal on the planet by a wide margin. It has killed more people than any king, any general, or any other predator. It has decided the fate of nations and edited the code of our DNA. It is a reminder that we are not as separate from the natural world as we like to think. We are still part of a complex, brutal, and beautiful biological system where even the smallest creature can bring a civilization to its knees. Our ancestors survived because they were tough, They were smart, and they were lucky, and they passed that luck down to us, one drop of blood at a time. When you think about the vast stretch of time we've covered, from the first hominids in the African Rift Valley to the modern laboratories of the 21st century, the mosquito is the one constant. It has been there at every birth, every migration, and every empire's fall. It is the silent partner in the human story, the shadow that followed us out of the trees and across the oceans. We survived the Ice Age, the Black Death, and 2 world wars, but the mosquito was always there, waiting in the tall grass or the stagnant pool, testing our defenses and forcing us to be better, faster, and stronger. It is the ultimate evolutionary pressure cooker. So, the next time you're outside on a warm summer evening and you hear that familiar, maddening buzz, don't just see it as an annoyance. See it as a connection to your deepest past. See it as the tiny, fragile representative of a force that has shaped your blood and your history more than almost anything else. You are part of an unbroken chain of survivors who managed to outlast the deadliest predator in history. That itch on your arm is a tiny reminder of a 7 million-year-old war that is still being fought every single day. And as you raise your hand to swat it, you're performing an action that has been repeated by trillions of humans across the spans of deep time, a simple reflexive gesture in a struggle for survival that shows no sign of ending. Our journey through time shows that humanity's greatest strength isn't just our ability to kill our enemies, but our ability to live through them. We didn't survive the mosquito by making it go away. We survived it by becoming a version of ourselves that could handle the assault. We built fires, we wove nets, we drained swamps, and we evolved. We took the worst the natural world had to offer, and we turned it into a reason to innovate. The mosquito pushed us, and in response, we grew. It is a grim, heavy kind of victory. One measured in billions of lives lost and a genetic code scarred by ancient fevers, but it is a victory nonetheless. We often look at the ruins of ancient cities or the tools of our ancestors and wonder how they did it, how they carved a world out of the wilderness. We look for the big answers in their architecture and their art. But the real answer to how we got here might be much smaller. It might be found in the smoke of a cave fire, the weave of an Egyptian net, or the shape of a single red blood cell. We are the ones who didn't get sick, or the ones who were just resistant enough to pull through. We are the survivors of the longest siege in history, a siege that began before we had words and continues even as we reach for the stars, which brings us to the final, chilling reality of our relationship with this tiny insect. For all our progress, for all our vaccines and our chemical sprays and our genetic engineering, we are still, at our core, the same prey we were 100,000 years ago. We are still made of the same warm blood, and we still breathe out the same trail of carbon dioxide that calls to them through the dark. We have built a world that feels safe and controlled, but that world is still inhabited by a creature that doesn't care about our technology or our history. It only cares about the next meal. And it is incredibly patient. It's easy to forget, in the comfort of our modern lives, that we are still part of this ancient cycle. We walk through our air-conditioned buildings and our paved streets, and we think we've won. But the mosquito is still there, just outside the door, in the puddles after a rainstorm or the damp corners of the garden. It is waiting for the sun to go down, for the wind to die, and for a human to step out into the evening air. It is a biological machine perfected over millions of years for one specific purpose, and it is not going to give up its place in the world just because we've developed a bit of science. The history of humanity is a history of endurance, a long march through a gauntlet of threats that tried to wipe us out before we could even begin. The mosquito was the most persistent of those threats, a constant, buzzing reminder of our own fragility. We survived because we had to, because the alternative was extinction. We carry the scars of that survival in our blood and the memory of it in our instincts. Every time you swat a mosquito, you are reaching back across the millennia, connecting with an ancestor who did the exact same thing under a different sky. It is the most human thing you can do. We tend to tell ourselves stories where we are the masters of our domain, the conquerors of the wild. But the story of the mosquito reminds us of a different truth. It tells us that we are players in a game where we don't always set the rules. It tells us that sometimes the biggest changes in our history come from the smallest places. And it tells us that our survival was never a guarantee. It was a hard-won prize, paid for with the lives of billions and the reshaping of our very souls. We are here because we survived the deadliest animal on Earth, but the war is far from over. Tonight, as the sun sets and the air grows still, trillions of tiny wings will begin to beat. They will rise from the marshes of the Nile, the rice paddies of Asia, and the suburban backyards of America. They will follow the scent of our breath and the heat of our skin, just as they have for millions of years. They are not fueled by malice, only by a relentless, ancient biological drive. They are the same insects that bit the first humans, and they will likely be the same ones that bite the last. We have spent our entire existence trying to escape them, but in the end, we are bound together in a struggle that defines us both. In the grand tally of human existence, we like to think our ingenuity is our greatest shield. We believe our medicine and our machines have finally tipped the scales in our favor. But look closely at the numbers, and you'll see the mosquito is still remarkably good at what it does. It doesn't need to win every battle. It only needs to land one bite. And as long as we are made of blood and breath, the hunt will continue. You can swat, you can spray, and you can hide, but you can never truly leave the battlefield. For as long as there have been humans, there has been the wine in the dark. And for as long as there are humans, the hunt will never end. This is the weight of our history, a debt paid in every drop of blood we have ever lost to the smallest, most patient killer the world has ever known. The mosquito isn't just an insect. It is the gavel that nature uses to decide who is fit to survive, and the court is always in session.